product, which is women and caregiver crimes and being convicted for crimes of a person in their care, and then women and the high rate of their conviction for crimes that never occurred. And I think the first one being 40% and the second one being 33% are the actual statistics that I've managed to find so far. So that's definitely kind of right on the number with what I found so far in my own research. Um, so what would be your personal view then on this disparity in the system? I mean, is it more
Well,
harsh or more lenient towards women? Because there is the other factor of that, although Miss Butler was sentenced to death row, statistically women are much less likely to be sentenced to death row. But then you've got that they're much more likely to be convicted for crimes that didn't happen. So, I mean, do you have a personal view on this, on why, or
r-
on how you feel about it?
right. I mean, I think, you've just got these stereotypes about women. Well, stereotypes and the reality of it that oftentimes women are the caregivers. They're in these sort of close domestic relationships, and when you've got a tragedy and either police or a neighbor or a jilted lover or whatever the case may be, where a story is concocted that can play on this stereotype of the evil woman, the woman who kills her own child. And once you get there, then I think it's just incredibly hard to undo that, because the story, just the death of the child, you also see it, spousal abuse, battered women's syndrome, a lot of that kind of thing. But most often you see the women being convicted of crimes involved, just like these family violence crimes in the San Antonio Four. It's a domestic situation, and oftentimes there are allegations that, like you say, the vast majority of times it's not that somebody else committed the crime, it's that the crime never happened. Like there was no crime.
Mm-hmm.
And and I think that a lot of the reason that kind of stuff happens is one, there are these sort of implicit biases and stereotypes against, the scorned woman, or the woman who dreams of being childless and liberated and things like that. I mean, we've got a case right now where I mean, it's just heartbreaking. A 6-year-old child, the mother has to make salsa for work the next day. And her child's like in her pajamas in bed, and the mom picks her up and drags her to the grocery store at 10 o'clock at night. And next thing she realizes she can't find her daughter in the grocery store. And 45 minutes later, her daughter is found dead on the side of the road with a tire track on her arm. And she's 6 years old, and the mom is absolutely hysterical. I mean, she's just not making any sense at all when she's talking to the police, as I would be too. And ultimately, what we believe and have evidence of is that it was actually a police officer who just had some mental illness stuff going on, who had taken the child with the intention of kind of bringing the child back and being the hero of the day to sort of win this woman's love. And he had confessed this to his attorney, and also had recently shot himself in the chest while wearing a bulletproof jacket, and blamed it on a black man, sending like the entire police department out, terrorizing the community looking for this black man who shot this police officer, when actually he'd done it to himself to get sympathy from his wife, who was intending to divorce him. So all of this, information was known at the time of our client's trial, and yet the jury did not hear this. And she was convicted and served 20 years in prison before the parole board finally entertained or listened to the story of the lawyer who had heard this police officer confess. And so she couldn't get that information out in court, but she was able to get it out to the parole board, who ultimately released our client. But I mean, it's really heartbreaking. But the gender discrimination is just.
So we had just gotten to pretty much talking about the conclusion of the gender disparity, if you remember
Right.
where you
And
left off.
right. And I think, you know, gender disparity is certainly one of the disparities that you see, but there's also a really major inequality that sort of overlays all of this, which is race discrimination. You've got race discrimination, racial bias, confirmation bias, implicit bias. People approach everything with their own sort of sets of internal biases that really overlays all of it. So do more people end up in prison solely because they're black? Is there really explicit, intentional racial discrimination that's causing these numbers that reflect severe discrimination in the system? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure that the answer to that is yes, but what we do know is that race discrimination, racial bias is present at every single stage of this. In all of those wrongful conviction factors, you've got it at the police presence in the poor communities, in the black communities. Poverty is another major factor, inequality that overlays all of this. I mean, when you've got 13% of the U.S. population that is black, but 62% of all of DNA exonerations being African American, I mean, you've got a big problem there.
Hmm.
And one of the projects that is in our region is the New Orleans Innocence Project out of Louisiana, and they're, oh gosh, if you ever want to study race discrimination and wrongful conviction, like that's where you should start, in Louisiana. And their director is just very eloquent and articulate on it. And she said something when we had a regional conference the other day or the other month, and she said something that I think is really true, which was her client was not targeted because he's black. He's targeted because they didn't care who the actual perpetrator was, because the perpetrator was black.
Hmm.
So it's like, just, you know, they focus on the race, and it's just sort of this disregard and lack of care and intentionalness and being careful that you might see in a non-black, non-poor community, that is just so present in all of these cases where you've got racial minorities and class inequalities. So I think that's also really important to keep in mind, and it just sort of imbues the fabric of all of these cases. And
We talked about women, and then we've talked about the race one, which is obviously the big, huge one. But then also, I'd like to look at some of the youth inequality and why maybe youth are especially susceptible to some of these things.
Right. And, that statistic that I gave you about 13% of the population is Black, 62% of all DNA exonerations involve African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
But once you look at the percentage of DNA exonerations involving a person who was arrested as a minor, then you're at 88% of all DNA exonerations involve African Americans and minors. So it's like the more groups, layers of inequality you add on there, the worse. And with minors in particular, they are really they're really susceptible to false confessions. They're impressionable. They sort of take this idea that, kids are all about the here and now, right? And so you're sort of applying these pressures and they just want it to end and aren't thinking about sort of the long-term consequences. And also may or may not have this appreciation of how flawed the system can be. So you hear again and again, well, I'll just tell them what they want to hear, and then they'll find out down the road that it's not true, that I didn't do it, that somebody else did. But once you can, yeah, so I mean, I just think that of all the wrongful conviction factors, false confessions and not minorities, minors just go hand in hand. And I think that you see a lot of that in there. You also see again and again these just extremely harsh sentences for minors, and minors being tried as adults, and minors being sentenced to life without parole on these crimes where they really shouldn't be, and it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah. Wow. So I guess to wrap it all up, now that we've talked about some of the inequalities and we've talked about why they're there and all the obstacles with Innocence Projects, I do want to know how this all affects what you do at the Innocence Project. How do these inequalities make it harder for you? Or maybe make it easier if you've got that one too. But how do they affect your work?
Well, I think that there's several different levels to that, but one of the things is just being really aware of it. You can go to all these sort of trainings and learn about the fact that, for example, minors are significantly more prone to false confessions than others. And then when you learn sort of this background information and you're reading these cases and you see what you're reading these confessions and it's just not making sense, you can sort of pick it up more easily when you're going through this stuff. Same with the race discrimination. Like when you're trying to figure out, like, why did the police target your person to begin with? Like, what's going on in that community? What kind of internal biases did the police department have? Does the prosecutor have? Does the jury have? How is that playing out in why they're even convicting these people in the first place? Like, one of the things that we constantly have to deal with is, in fact, one of the exercises that I give when I go and talk at schools or when we first have students come in for their summer internship is I give them the first letter that we received from two different clients. And one of the clients was excluded as a contributor. He was exonerated. His DNA was determined not to be there, and he didn't rape the woman, and he was exonerated. The other was included. It was absolutely him.